Well, we're continuing our early Advent series, Greetings from Anywhere But Nineveh. We're walking through the story of Jonah, and today we finally get to the big fish. I say finally because that's the only thing most of us know about Jonah. We've been waiting for it. We've only been waiting 1 week, but we're finally here, and then we're past it. The fish is like 1/4 of the story, and so let's dig into it today. We'll be reading from Jonah chapter 1, verse 17 through chapter 2, verse 3, and then picking up chapter 2, verse 9 through chapter 3, which is a nice reminder that none of the chapters and verses were put in originally, and sometimes we Bible nerds like to joke that they were put in by someone riding on horseback, and who knows how they ended up falling where they did. But here is our story for today. Meanwhile, the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. From the belly of the underworld, I cried out for help. You have heard my voice. You had cast me into the depths in the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your strong waves and rushing water passed over me. But me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. That which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. The Lord's word came to Jonah a second time. Get up and go to Nineveh, that great city, and declare against it the proclamation that I am commanding you. And Jonah got up and went to Nineveh according to the Lord's word. Now Nineveh was indeed an enormous city, a 3 days walk across. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So we are going to talk about the big fish, but in order to talk about the big fish, we need to talk about dragons, and in order to talk about dragons, we need to talk about nothing. So let me ask you, what do you think of when you think of nothing? Nothing. Yeah, some of you are just like, nothing, right? So that's not really a good question. What do you picture when you picture nothing? If you had to assign it an image, what might you picture? Space, darkness, yeah. We tend to picture emptiness, right? Well, we cover this all the time because I think it's one of the keys to reading the Bible effectively and responsibly, and that is to remember that the Bible was written thousands of years ago, halfway around the world, in ancient languages, seen through a cultural lens and worldview that no longer fully exists, even in the places where the Bible was written. How we see the world changes. We didn't see the curvature of the earth until the middle of the last century. Our conception of what the earth is different just in the last 100 years, much less 3,000 years ago. Now, does this mean that the Bible is impossible to read? Some of you are like, no, it's impossible to read for other reasons, but not that one, yeah? No, it's a good thing that it's not impossible to read, but it does mean that when you come across something in the Bible that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense or grates against how you see or understand the world, or just doesn't, like, this is kind of weird, maybe remind yourself that it's coming from a different place and begin to ask, how would they have seen the world? What lenses would have been baked in then that we don't have? Or what lenses are baked into our point of view that weren't there then? And the concept of nothing is one of those mismatches. When you think of creation, if you think of creation, if you're imagining how Genesis chapter 1 begins, what kind of a blank slate do you imagine God starting with? You probably think of nothing, which is totally fine, because that's how we were shaped by science class and philosophy class, right? Like, space is this vast empty thing, and at one time it was the size of a marble, and who knows what happened before that. The scientists with any sort of humility will say we can't know. Those of us in the religious world will say, God was a part of that. But that is not obviously how at all the people who wrote and experienced the Bible originally would have pictured it. This is how the story of creation begins in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, and heavens and the earth literally means sky and the land. Sky and the land. The earth, the land, was without shape or form. You see, there was already something there. Before God even spoke anything into existence, God had something to start with. It was land that was without shape or form. Some other translations might use the words formless, desolate emptiness, or wild and waste. What kind of land do you picture? A a desert, right? Or wilderness, right? Something that's just kind of, it's empty, but it's not empty as in there's nothing there. It's empty in that there is no purpose or no order. And if you can grab that image, you are beginning to understand how they understood nothing. Nothing was something that had no purpose and no order. Well, Genesis 1 continues, and it says that darkness was over the face of the deep, or darkness was over the face of the deep sea, or darkness was over the face of the deep abyss. And there we get two more pictures for nothing. What are they? Darkness and a deep sea, right? Or a deep abyss. We get three pictures, three realms of nothingness from the beginning. We've got like a desert wasteland, wilderness. We've got a deep sea, and we have darkness, things with no order, no purpose. They're also inhospitable, right? It's possible to survive in the desert, but it's extremely hard. You need a lot of help, right? Is it possible for human beings to survive in the ocean without any sort of submersibles or boats? No, it's not. We don't do that. And how many of you have ever broken a pinky toe trying to get to the bathroom in the middle of the night and know that darkness is not that hospitable either? How many have broken both of them in one trip to the bathroom in the middle of the night? Guilty, right? So they would have known this. They would have felt this. Their picture of nothing was created by all these things, because remember their geography, the Holy Land, the Promised Land, Israel and Judah. It was this fertile stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea, a deep sea, and what's on the other side? The Arabian Desert. And then what's overhead half of the 24 hours? Darkness. They were constantly surrounded by these inhospitable places. These are places of chaos and disorder, danger, and even death. But when God starts to create, what does God bring to the disorder? Order and purpose. Exactly. So day one, pop quiz, God separates what from what? Light from dark. God separates light from dark. It's bringing a measure of order, taking that nothingness, disorder, darkness, and bounding it in one place. Notice that God doesn't do away with darkness. That will actually happen at the end of Revelation. That's one of the beautiful pictures, is the chaos realms are gone at the end. But right now, God doesn't do away with darkness, but God gives darkness its own area, but puts a boundary around it, and then gives us light, a period of time in which the world can flourish. Day two, God separates the chaotic waters. This one is a little bit harder to picture, because this idea of just there's water everywhere, and God pushes some water up into the sky and some water down, and now the earth is kind of this undulating ocean, and we've got water up. Really, like picture a snow globe, but we're on the inside. That's kind of how they pictured it, that there was this wall or something holding back the water, because when it rains, where does the water come from? Up, right? In the story of Noah, when the flood comes, it says that God let loose the water that he had been holding back. The story of the flood is a story of decreation and recreation. So God holds back the waters upward, and God holds back the waters downward, creating this space for life where it can happen. And then on day three, God separates the sea to make dry land, right? I'll just assume that some of you thought that. God separates the sea to create dry land. But God doesn't just do that. So he sets the boundaries to the sea, right? Now he takes that undulating, chaotic waters and pushes it out of the way and creates a boundary. But then now we've got the desert. The very tag of day three is that God then creates the plants and the fruit trees. God creates the fertile place where people can live and find shade and grow food and all these things. So God has pushed back the darkness, God has pushed back the waters, and God has pushed back the desert and the wasteland to create a space in which life can flourish. And if you are someone who loves spreadsheets and loves order, and some of you are like that, you are going to love the rest of Genesis chapter 1. Because God is so ordered. God spends days 1, 2, and 3 separating, and then spends days 4, 5, and 6 filling, but filling the spaces he separated. So day 1, God separates light from dark. What did God make on day 4? The sun, the moon, and the stars. Day 2, God separates creating the sky and the ocean. What do you think God made on day 5? The birds and the fish, right? And then God separated on day 3 the waters to create the dry land. What got made on day 6? Animals, right? And then humans. He See, it's ordering, order. There's this pattern. God is in control. God knows what he's doing. And throughout the whole week of creation, or the whole period of time of creation, is it good or is it bad? It's good. Everything is good. And then at the very end, God gives humanity a purpose. You are going to be my representatives. You're going to steward creation. You're going to be fruitful and multiply. You're going to ensure that all life on earth is fruitful and multiplies. And at that point, God goes from saying it's good to saying it's very good. Order is good. Purpose makes it even better. Well, there's something else hiding in plain sight here in Genesis chapter 1. So God doesn't eliminate the chaos realms of darkness in the ocean and the wilderness. God creates boundaries around them, but did God leave those realms empty? No, God filled them as well, right? In the darkness realm, God put the moon, but God also put the stars. Now, we know them to be burning balls of gas, but they didn't know that. To them, and I'm not saying literally, but to them symbolically, it represented the heavenly beings. The spiritual beings that would serve God and do God's work. You know, there's a sense, and people still get that sense today, that there's something else going on around us here on earth, and that's how they pictured it. It was the stars, but they were up in the realm of the darkness. Well, then on day 5, it tells us that God created the great sea animals, which is really a chickening out of the translators because it should read the sea monsters. It literally is the word for sea monster. God created the fish and also the sea monsters, which I think is awesome. And so do all the boys at summer camp. If you ever chaperone summer camp, just re-listen to this message because you're going to get asked about dragons and sea monsters. And then on day 6, God pushes back the desert and creates all these animals, and it also describes an animal that crawls along the ground. What are you starting to picture knowing what's coming in Genesis chapter 2 and 3? A serpent, a snake, right? So there's these realms of chaos and disorder and danger and death, and they're not empty. There are creatures out there, but here's the thing. Was it good or was it bad? It was good. It was all good. It was always good. And by the end, it was very good. When everything is in its place, when everything is doing what it was made to do, when everything is going according to God's plan, it's all good. Psalm 104 celebrates a sea monster playing in the ocean. You're meant to think of like a little puppy splashing around at the beach. Even the sea monster can be this glorious example of God's creative power. But these things become dangerous when they get out of place. When the beings from the disordered realm encroach on the ordered realm, that's when they get dangerous. So we get these stories woven through the Bible of spiritual beings that revolted against God and ended up being cast out of heaven. And that's where we get the idea of the evil forces in the world. And then the sea monster is splashing around in the ocean. And in some passages of the Bible, it comes ashore. And I've already said this word once. What do you think it becomes when it comes ashore, when it encroaches on order? It's a dragon. This is where we get the idea of dragons in the Bible. And then, of course, we've already talked about the snake, a desert creature meant to be out there, but it winds its way, sneaks in through the bars into the garden and starts causing trouble with Adam and Eve. Now, again, this is all symbolic language. This is a poem. These are stories. I'm not saying that there were literal dragons. We just haven't dug them up yet. That's not how it goes. But in the visions that prophets had, in the poetry of the prophets, in the apocalyptic poems in the Bible, we get the picture of dragons representing evil empires and their leaders. In Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 3, God describes Pharaoh as a great dragon. Some other translations say great sea monster. The CEB, which we read from, calls him a crocodile. That's because they're not referring to any actual biological creature, but rather this idea of a monster that lives in the water that then comes out to encroach on the goodness of God's world. And so the CEB was like, oh, let's do crocodile because it's the Nile, something like that. Now, Pharaoh isn't literally a dragon, right? He's a person. But they use this imagery almost like a costume or almost like a political cartoon. How many of you ever read a political cartoon with a talking donkey or a talking elephant? Or some celebrity or politician or athlete is drawn as some sort of animal-human hybrid, and you're supposed to take the qualities of that animal and apply it to... That's what is going on. As Pharaoh is very much still a human being, but he is embodying the spirit of the dragon, the chaos monster that has come out of its realm and is now encroaching on God's good world, which might lead to us asking the question, but why did you have to use monsters and dragons and talking snakes? Why couldn't you use something that actually existed? And this is, again, where we have to remember that they are looking through different cultural lenses than we do. In the time of the scriptures, particularly the Old Testament, there was a myth that was shared by almost all of the cultures in the ancient Near East. And it was about a battle between a god and a great dragon of the sea. Now, the myth went slightly differently in each culture. The Babylonians, that was their creation myth. The god Marduk fought the monster Tiamat. The Canaanites had one about Baal battling a sea monster. We even see echoes of this in Greek and Roman mythology. How many of you know the story of Hercules fighting Hydra? That's an echo of that myth. The sea monster threatens the stability of God's good world, or if you're outside of Israel, the stability of the nation or the stability of creation. And who is it that's going to come and save us? A god, a divine being, or a demigod comes and fights the chaos dragon and wins. And then that god usually ascends a mountain, throws a big party, and one of them, that god gets murdered. That turned out poorly for that one. But the rest of them, they then take the throne and rule over the land or the people or the nation or the kingdom that they just saved. Here's the thing, though. We get this story of a divine being defeating and vanquishing chaos. Do you feel like chaos and disorder are gone? How many of you wake up every morning being like, everything is just right? Even in your own house. How many of you live with a chaos monster, age 5 or under? Right? Chaos and disorder and death and danger are not gone. Right? And in fact, some of the ancient cultures recognized this, and for some of them, this became the story they told at the beginning of spring, when the world went from a season that felt like death into a season that felt like new life. So why did so many cultures have a variation of this myth? It's because it's a universal concern and experience. You just admitted to that 30 seconds ago. We still feel this today. And so then we still have to ask, why dragons, why sea monsters, why crafty serpents, why fantastic beasts? And that's because the writers of the Bible looked at the same world we're looking at, through different lenses, but the same world. Human nature's all still there. And no matter how much work they put in to stewarding, no matter how hard they tried to be good and do what God asked them to do, chaos and disorder still felt like it was always around and always on the prowl. Sometimes it was forces of nature. It does not matter how good our weather predictions get, how good our radars get. How many of you have ever had a hurricane or a tropical storm in the middle of the night and it feels like everything's about to fall apart? You're watching your windows or your sliding glass door flex. You're watching trees go down. And you just feel like this is not science. How many of us turn on the news and see world powers that seem like they are nothing but forces of chaos? How many of us live with individuals who feel like forces of chaos? How many of us can look in the mirror and understand that at one time or another we have been forces of chaos? And sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. And so when the writers of the Bible wanted to reflect on this universal experience, their minds and their imaginations were already preloaded and formed by these stories. So they did what all the other cultures did. They adopted it, but they also adapted it. Because it's different with our God. It's different with the real God, they would say. So what makes the dragon-slaying theme in the Bible different? First off, the God opposing the dragon isn't one little g God amidst a whole bunch of little g gods. It's the big G God, the only God, Yahweh. And we already know that from Genesis chapter 1, our God stands for purpose and order and life, which is directly opposed to the forces of chaos, disorder, and death. Secondly, we believe our God is the creator, and God made everything, and everything was good. So that means even if there is a chaos dragon that finds its way out of the sea or wiggles in from the desert or falls down from heaven, God still made that creature, and at one time it was good. It might be inherently dangerous because it's big or strong or has scales or teeth or claws, but when it's in its place, it is good. Everything in creation was at one time good. Everything in creation is inherently good. They and we become agents of chaos when we choose to no longer be and do what God made us to be and do. And third, and most importantly, never in the Bible is God actually threatened by chaos. Never in the Bible is God threatened by the dragon or the serpent or the angels or whatever form it takes. In other versions of the myth, some of these gods, it's like a Marvel movie. They fight to the very last minute, and they win with their last breath. Or like the one wins, and he goes up the mountain, someone kills him. That didn't work out so good, right? But in the Bible, God tames the dragon in three ways. And number one is that God just wins easily. In Psalm 74, the psalmist tells us, "Yet God has been my king from ancient days, God who makes salvation happen in the heart of the earth. You split the sea with your power. You shattered the heads of the sea monsters on the water. You crushed Leviathan's heads, and you gave it to the desert dwellers for food." Not only does God kill the chaos dragon, it becomes barbecue for the humans. Like, that's how much not of a threat the dragon is. Secondly, the scripture will downplay and minimize the dragon. We've already talked about Psalm 104, this little sea puppy out there just splashing around in the water. Isn't that cute? Little sea monster playing games out in the ocean, because it's nothing compared to the power of God. And then thirdly, we've also talked about this. It becomes a costume that human empires or human leaders put on. What's the ultimate fate of human leaders or empires that are opposed to God? They either turn to God or they fall. It's the only two options. Never a threat to God. They might cause chaos and disorder and death and destruction, but they're never an ultimate threat. And in Jonah, we get both of the last two. We get the minimizing of the dragon, and we get the costume. So let's start with what we know from last week. Jonah was called to go where? Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. Exactly. Is Assyria good or bad? Bad. Bad or very bad? I feel like you're at the eye doctor. 1 or 2, 3 or 4, right? Very bad. Assyria was the biggest, baddest, worst that there was until Babylon came along, but it hasn't come along yet. Worst, most violent, evil empire. They are, for all intents and purposes, the dragon. They are the dragon of the desert. They are the one who, just a couple hundred years after the story of Jonah, are going to come through and wipe out the 10 tribes in the northern nation of Israel. And they're going to siege Jerusalem in the south. They won't succeed, but they're going to cause a lot of damage and then eventually go home. So God sends Jonah right into the heart of the dragon. But does Jonah go? No. Where does Jonah go? The exact opposite direction. Instead of heading east into the desert to get to Assyria, through one of the chaos realms into the heart of the dragon, he heads the exact opposite direction to Tarshish, which is portrayed as a paradise Eden-like place full of elephants and apes and peacocks and gold and silver. But here's the ironic thing. He does not want to go through the desert to get to the dragon. Instead, he gets on a what? A boat which goes over a what? A sea. He finds himself on top of another chaotic realm. In running from one chaos monster, he will soon find himself face to face with another. And God riles up a great storm. The ship is about to break. The sailors are trying to figure out whose fault it is. And Jonah quotes Taylor Swift, "Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me." And he convinces them to do what? Throw him overboard into the chaotic waters. Do you think he's thinking, surely some fish will swallow me and this will be all right? No, what does he think is going to happen? He's going to die. This is the most selfless thing Jonah does in the whole book. He expects to die. This is not a habitable place. And suddenly, the great sea monster shows up. Now remember, sea monsters, when they're in their place, they're not supposed to be a problem, right? When they're out in the ocean doing their thing, they're fine. Who is out of place here? Who is the chaos monster here? Jonah. Who's the reason for the storm? Jonah, right? The sea monster is just doing his thing. Then he sees a little human hot dog. He's like, that sounds good. I'm going to eat that for lunch. This monster is big. It's dangerous. But it's Jonah's fault. But as it turns out, it ends up not being a danger, does it? It ends up saving him. And not only that, it's not a sea monster in this story. It's just a big fish. This is the minimizing of the sea dragon. Meanwhile, the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Not only is it just a fish, who's directing the fish? Who sent the fish? God did. right? It's not just that it's just a fish, but that this sea monster fish thing is under God's control and can even become a vehicle for salvation. So Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish because he recognizes the significance of what God has done. I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. From the belly of the underworld, I cried out for help. You have heard my voice. You have cast me into the depths of the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your strong waves and rushing water passes over me. Remember last week we said as soon as Jonah decided to run from God, he headed what direction? Down. Down to the port, down to the ship, down into the ship, laid down to take a nap, then got tossed down into the sea, and then got swallowed down into the belly of the fish. And notice Jonah's prayer. I am in the belly of the underworld. I am as good as dead, and yet you heard me. Jonah was as far down as you can get, as good as gone, as far from God as he could run. And yet when he recognized his problem, he cried out to God, and God answered him. So as we begin to shape this toward the season of Advent and prepare ourselves for Christmas, remember last week we said that the story of Jonah is not an example, it's a mirror. We're not meant to copy Jonah, live like Jonah. We're meant to see ourselves in Jonah, or at least look at Jonah and say, how am I like Jonah? How am I not like Jonah? And so last week we recognized that we all run from God in some way, for some reason, at some time. And so we all need a Savior just like Jonah does. And this week we begin to shape and head toward the good news, which is that we all need a Savior. And when we recognize it, no matter where we are, no matter how far gone we are, no matter how far gone the person you're praying for is, are they too far to be saved by God? No. If Jonah can be rescued from the depths of the belly of the sea monster in the depths of the chaos waters, you too can find salvation with the Lord. The person or the people or the nation or the group of people that you're praying for can find salvation through the Lord. Jonah's prayer ends this way. But me, I will offer a sacrifice to you with a voice of thanks. That which I have promised, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. I'm a prophet. I know what my job is. I'm ready to do it. Wherever you send me, whatever you tell me to say, I'm going to do it. I'm ready to answer the call. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. The Lord's word came to Jonah a second time. Get up and go to Nineveh, the great city, and declare against it the proclamation that I am commanding you. And Jonah got up and went to Nineveh according to the Lord's word. Is this the same Jonah coming out of the fish that went into the fish? No. He is completely transformed, at least in this moment. Spoiler alert, it goes downhill again. This is not a children's story where everything wraps up beautifully. And there's actually a really cool hint, though, that a change was coming. And by really cool, I mean super Bible nerdy. This is one of those things that it does not matter that our English translation has lost and doesn't include, but I think it's so cool, and I want you to know this. And at the end, you can just be like, Dan, that was so nerdy, I don't care. But I think some of you will care. And that is that in Hebrew, nouns have a gender, just like in Spanish. Certain nouns are masculine, certain nouns are feminine. And when it says that God provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, that fish is male. It's masculine. The noun is masculine. But then when it says Jonah prayed from the belly of the fish, that fish is now female. That noun is now feminine. Now this throws all sorts of wrenches in the gears if we're trying to make this a historical story. But remember, we said whether it's history or not, we're supposed to learn from the story. So how might this serve the story? How might this deepen the story? How might it make it more significant for us? What do you think of when you think of life inside of the belly of a female? Pregnancy. And at the end of a pregnancy, where everything goes the way it's supposed to go, what happens? Birth. And what do you call it if you've already been born and then you go through it again? Born again, rebirth. New birth, new life. This is a central and repeated theme all throughout the Bible. And why is that? Because the kind of change God calls us to make is not just a tweak here or a tweak there. We are not here to optimize. We are here to be completely and so deeply transformed that the only way we can even attempt to talk about it is to say that we have been born anew. And in the story of Jonah, what is the vehicle for being born anew? the sea monster in the chaotic waters. God's power and goodness and mercy are so great that even the most dark and dangerous place on the face of the earth can still be a tool for bringing people into a relationship with God. And this points us to our final point, and it creates our deepest connection with the story of Advent and the gift of Jesus. We said last week, we all need a Savior, and God has a gift for that. What was the gift? Who was the gift? Jesus. And Jesus came as a baby, which is a type of what animal? Human, right? Jesus came as a human. Why did Jesus come as a human? If you haven't wrestled with that question before, I invite you to do that. You're going to need a couple cups of coffee, but I invite you to wrestle with that. There are lots of reasons why God came in human flesh. The technical theological word we use at Christmas time is incarnation. God became flesh and dwelt among us. Why? There's lots of reasons, but here's a big one. We're going to turn to Matthew 12. Jesus is sparring with religious leaders. He's cast out some demons, and the religious leaders are like, see, yeah, he's a bad guy because he's doing the good things with the demons. He must work for the devil. And Jesus is like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And they're like, yeah, well, prove it. Show us a sign. And Jesus replied, an evil and unfaithful generation searches for a sign, but it won't receive a sign except for Jonah's sign. Just as Jonah was in the whale's belly for 3 days and 3 nights, so the human one will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And this is another one of those areas where our translators chickened out. Jesus doesn't say whale's belly. He says the belly of the sea monster. The Greek word there is the word used for sea monster in the Iliad and the Odyssey and all the Greek and Roman myths. Jesus knows that this wasn't just a fish, but it was meant to be the embodiment of disorder and death and danger. And he likens himself to Jonah, who goes into the belly of death and comes out the other side. And what comes out of it? Salvation, new life, transformation. And spoiler alert for next week, when Jonah does his ministry in Assyria, every human and all the cows repent and follow God. Jonah was not just saved for his own sake, but for the sake of the world. Jesus was not just saved for his own sake, but rather opening up the way of salvation and new life for us. Jesus sees in the story of Jonah the path to saving the world, but notice it wasn't the path in which God is slicing up sea monsters and handing it out as barbecue. The way to saving the world is by allowing death to do its worst and still coming out the other side. Because if the biggest, baddest, worst force that could ever oppose God is no match for God, then God wins. Even when it looks like death wins, friends, I promise you, death does not get the final word. And if Jesus can go through the power of sin and death, no matter how hard they try to oppose God, God's good world, God's mercy, God's power, God's authority will win. And Jesus opens up that way so that we can follow him through too.